Hi, my beautiful people. We're going to continue on with chapter 4. And chapter 4 is about Cain and Abel. And the first section is Cain's murder of Abel. And again, if you're new, please hit the like button. Help me grow my channel. And if you have any questions or anything, just leave a comment. And we're going to go ahead and jump right on into it. So chapter 4 verse 1 is the birth of Cain, and the first verse, sorry. I was looking at two things at once here. And let's go ahead and read verse 1 in chapter 4. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. So when it says Adam knew his wife, so what does that mean exactly? So this is the first mention of sex in the Bible. Most terms nowadays are very vulgar and very violent, but the Bible sees sex as a means of knowing one another in a committed relationship. Before the fall of Adam and Eve, sex was impure and was pure, and not unclean. Only in its misuse was it impure and unclean. Only if it was misused. Then it says, when he said, bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. So the name Cain meant I've got him, or here he is. Possibly Eve thought that Cain was the seed that God promised, the deliverer who would come from Eve. And so let's go ahead and continue on to verse 2 through 5. And 2 through 5 says, and she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So the verse 2 through 5 is the birth of Abel and the offerings of Cain and Abel. So in when it says Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So agriculture and the domestication of animals were practiced among the earliest humans. If you see me flipping pages, it's my notes. Excuse me of that. And then in verse 3, when it talks about Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. So Cain brought his offering to the tree of life because the cherubim guarded the way to the tree of life. It's possible that Cain, Abel, and later others met with God at the tree of life. And by faith, Abel offered up a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And that's referenced in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. Cain's offering was the effort of dead religion, while Abel's offering was made in faith, in a desire to worship God in spirit and in truth. And in verse 4, when it talks about Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. So this shows Abel's offering was extra special, which is why it was respectful in God's eyes. The fat was prized as luxury and was to be given to God when the animal was sacrificed. And you can find that in Leviticus chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, and chapter 7, verse 23 through 25. The burning of fat in sacrifice before God is called a sweet aroma to the Lord. And that's also in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 6. The offering of Cain was no doubt more pleasing because Abel's offering would have been more of a bloody mess, but God was more concerned with faith in the heart than the artistic beauty of the tilling of the ground. So in verse 5, when it talks about Cain was very angry and his countenance fell. So Cain's anger was rooted in pride, and the sin became worse. And Cain now committed the sins of spiritual pride and hypocrisy. And that is not a good thing. So in verse 6 and 7, talks about God's warning to Cain. And verse 6 and 7 says, let me get to it here. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. So when God asks, why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? Well, God dealt with Cain in terms of a loving confrontation instead of an automatic affirmation. He came to him in a loving way rather than hostility. God made it clear to Cain that Cain would be accepted if he did well, and that's if. Of course, God knew the answer, but he wanted Cain to answer from his heart and to resist the pull toward violence and anger that was within him. And in verse 7 it says, if you don't do well, sin lies at the door. So God warned Cain about the destructive powers of sin. And Cain could resist sin and find blessings, or he could give into sin and be devoured. The sin could literally devour you. Because without God as our master, we will technically be slaves of sin. If we don't have God, and we don't have God in our lives. So let's go on to verse 8, and this is where Cain murders Abel. And verse 8 says, And Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. So in the beginning of that verse, Cain is talking with his brother Abel. Cain planned to catch Abel by surprise, which is why he carried on. He was luring him with pleasant conversation because he didn't want Abel to know what was coming. This shows of premeditated murder, and he clearly ignored God's way of escape. God warned him and told him how to veer away from that sin. But he let the sin devour him anyway. And when he rose up and killed him, well, starting here, no human has ever died or been killed before. And from there on out, sin could not be contained. It went haywire. Sin exploded everywhere on this earth. You know, the downward course of sin among the young human race progressed quickly. Now, the hoped-for Redeemer was found to be a murderer, and the second son was the victim of murder. Sin wasn't stopped at the root of man's moral condition, quickly improved, and sin could not be contained. So the next section, it talks about God confronting Cain. And in verse 9, God questions Cain. So let's read verse 9. And it says, And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not, which means he lied to him. And I, my brother's keeper, or am I my brother's keeper? So that was a very sarcastic, rude thing for him to say to God, the one who gave him life. So when God is asking, where is your brother? Where is Abel? God already knew the answer. So God asked Cain because he wanted to give him the opportunity to confess his sins, repent, and start to do right after having done wrong. But after that, Cain decided to be sarcastic and say, Am I my brother's keeper? So the fact is that he was supposed to be his brother's keeper. But instead, he was his murderer and murdered him for the lowest of reasons. His rage was inspired purely of spiritual jealousy. And in Jude 11, warns of the way of Cain, which is unbelief, empty religion, leading to jealousy, persecution, and those truly godly and murderous anger. You can also reference that in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. So then we go on to verse 10 through 12. And this talks about God's curse upon Cain. And he said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Where thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth." So in verse 10, it talks about the voice of your brother's blood cries out from the ground. So the idea of blood crying out to God, it's an image, you can picture it, from the ground is later repeated in the Bible, actually. If you look at Numbers chapter 35, verse 29 through 34, it describes how the blood of the unpunished murderers defiles the land. And in verse 11, where he's cursing him from the earth. So the curse upon Cain was that Adam's curse would be amplified in regard to him. If bringing forth food from the earth would be hard for Adam, it would be impossible for Cain, who was a farmer, by the way. If Adam was driven from Eden, Cain would find no resting place on all the earth, which means a fugitive and a vagabond. So let's go ahead and continue to verse 13 through 15. And it talks about Cain complaining of the severity of God's judgment. Cain wasn't happy, but God gave him every stinking chance, and Cain still didn't listen, and now he's upset. So 13 through 15 says, "And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him." So in verse 13, when he says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." So Cain didn't feel bad about his sin, but only about his punishment. Just like what's going on today. They do not feel bad about sinning, but they feel bad about the punishment that God gives them. And it's no different today as it was back then. And in verse 15, when it says, "Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." So God didn't really want Cain to be killed by others, but it had to happen. As significant as God's judgment against Cain was, God did not want Cain killed by others. This is possibly because the population of the earth was precariously low. Not saying that's what it is, but from the research, it's possible. But we don't really know for sure. And the Lord set a mark on Cain. Therefore, God set an identifying and protective mark upon Cain. Despite the speculation of some, nobody really knows what this mark upon Cain was, because it doesn't say. All right, so the next section is Cain and his descendants. And verse 16 and 17 talks about Cain moving away and marries. So 16 and 17 says, And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife. Again, there it is again, knew his wife. And she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. So Cain and his wife had Enoch, and he ended up building a city and called the city Enoch after his firstborn son. And unto Enoch was born Irad. I'm going to do my best to pronounce these names. And Irad begat, which means bore, Mehuljah, and Mehuljah begat Methusal, and Methusal begat Lamech. These are hard words. Okay, so the land of Nod east of Eden. So verse 17, where it says Cain knew his wife. So in Genesis chapter 5 verse 4 says that Adam had other sons and daughters. It wasn't just Cain and Abel. They had multitudes of sons and daughters. Cain obviously married his sister though marrying a sister was against the law of God according to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which even prohibits the marrying of your half-sister. But this was long before God spoke that law to Moses and the world. So here, necessity demanded that Adam's sons marry his daughters. And at this point, the gene pool of humanity was pure enough to allow close marriage without harm of inbreeding. But as a stream can get more polluted, the further it flows from the source, there came a time when God decreed there no longer be marriage between close relatives because of the dangers of inbreeding. So let's look back at that again. And that's something that I didn't know, and I really didn't understand until I was like, and really even thought about it, really, until I actually got to looking at it. And they married, brothers and sisters married, but it wasn't impure back then, because that was before the law of Moses. And, excuse me. And at that point in time, the gene pool of humanity was pure enough to allow close marriage without harm of inbreeding. But as a stream can get more polluted the further it flows from the source, there came a time when God decreed there no longer be marriage between close relatives because of the dangers of inbreeding. Because the sin was getting greater and greater, and the stream flowed further and further and further. Even Abraham married his half-sister, Sarah. And that's in the book of Genesis, chapter 20, verse 12. God did not prohibit such marriages until the time of Moses, which is in the book of, you can reference that to Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 9. Marrying a brother or sister was not forbidden until God forbid it. And he did. He forbid it. And then we go on to where it says that Cain built a city. So here we see the beginning of an industry, an urbanization from this beginning. It was strongly man-centered, not God-centered. And that's another downfall. The fall of the human race continued and even increased after the city was built. So now we go on to verse 18 through 22, and this talks about the generation following Cain. Oops, sorry. And I'm going to do my best here. We're going to kind of skim through this part. I'm not the best at names, and I don't want to botch them. So we know that Cain had Enoch, and Enoch had Irad or Erad. And Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the first one was Adah, and the name of this other wife was Zillah. And the first wife, Adah, bore Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And the brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ, so instruments. And Zillah, the second wife, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And so, let's see. In verse 18, where it talks about Enoch was born Irad. So, rapid advancement, succeeding generations quickly made progress in areas such as the founding of a city, home building, the father of those who dwell in tents, music and arts, which is those who play harp and the flute, and metalworking, instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And Methuselah begot Lamech. The name Lamech means, or may mean, conqueror. He was the 6th from Adam on Cain's side. Lamech's arrogance in Genesis chapter 4, verse 23 and 24 is a contrast to the godliness of Enoch, which references Jude chapter 14. It says, Lamech took 2 wives, Adah and Zillah. So Lamech was the first bigamist in history, going against God's original plan for one man and one woman to become one flesh. The names of his wives and daughters show the emphasis in his heart. Adah means pleasure or beauty. Zillah means shade. His daughter's name was Naamah, which means loveliness. And then it continues with 23 and 24. And this verse 23 and 24 talks about Lamech's arrogant boast. And 23 and 24 says, And Lamech said unto his wives Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Okay, so when it says in verse 23, I have killed a man for wounding me, the way that he boasted, Lamech, the way that Lamech boasted about killing another, and the way he believed he could promise a retribution than God, shows a progressive degenerosity among humanity. And then when it says in verse 24, if Cain can be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So this is all a representation of humanism, a man-centered perspective. The city was Cain's city. It wasn't God's city. The focus of Lamech was his beautiful wives and his own perceived strength. But for all of Lamech's boasting, Neither he or his descendants are ever heard of again in the Bible. He came to nothing. And this is the end of his descendants, Cain and his descendants. So then it talks 25 and 26, in verse 25 and 26. It talks about Seth is born to Adam and Eve. So verse 25 and 26, which is the last two verses in chapter 4. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For God said, She hath made appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son. So Adam and Eve had many children who were not specifically named in the Bible record, but Seth was worthy of mention because he in some sense replaced Abel and was the one to whom the promise of a deliverer from the seed of a woman would be passed. And the men began to call on the name of the Lord. Even in those wicked days, the worship of God was not unknown. Some have called Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, the first revival, because it was the first indication of a spiritual resurgence, which is very awesome. Okay, so guys, excuse me, I keep yawning. I think I may do one more chapter tonight, but of course it'll be in the next video. So this ends chapter 5, and if you have any questions, please put it in the comments. You guys have a good night.